In this lesson, we will be examining life in the English colonies. Life in the English colonies, the big idea. The English colonies continued to grow despite many challenges. Main ideas: colonial governments were influenced by political changes in England. English trade laws limited free trade in the colonies. The Great Awakening and the Enlightenment led to ideas of political equality amongst many colonists. And the French and Indian War gave England control of more land in North America. Main idea 1. Colonial governments were influenced by political changes in England. King James II wanted more control over English government, including the colonies. The United Northern Colonies under one government were called the Dominion of New England in 1686. Parliament replaced the unpopular King James II and passed the English Bill of Rights in 1689. The colonies in the Dominion formed new assemblies and charters and could elect their own representatives. Under the English Bill of Rights, no imprisonment could be levied without due process of law. There could be no loss of property without due process of law. There would be no cruel or unusual punishment. No standing army would be allowed in time of peace without Parliament's consent. There would be no taxation without Parliament's consent. The subjects would have the right to bear arms. That is, the people would have the right to own weapons for their own use. Freedom of speech in Parliament would be enforced. Now, many of these rights that you see listed here are the same rights that we enjoy in the United States today. After the American Revolution and when the Constitution was being written, the founders of our nation understood that the English Bill of Rights was something that this new country, the United States, would demand be kept. And so the English Bill of Rights would be incorporated into our own form of government. Colonial governments. Each English colony had its own government. Each colony was independent of all the others. They did not view themselves as being like a single country. Each colony being independent meant that in a sense they were almost like their own country. Each government was given power by a charter. The charters were granted by the king. So the colonial governments owed loyalty to the king, but they did not owe loyalty to each other, so to speak. In other words, the colonies themselves generally were not united together. The English monarch had ultimate authority over the colonies. Governors and legislatures. The governor served as head of the government at the colony level. Most were assisted by a council of advisors. That is, each governor would have a group of men who were experts in whatever particular things the governor needed to be advised on. Some colonies had elected representatives. Some colonies had their own law-making bodies, like a legislature. Virginia established the first colonial legislature in 1619, and this was known as the Virginia House of Burgesses. The town meeting was the center of New England political life. Town meetings were purely democratic. Everybody that went to the town meeting had the right to speak. They had the right to have their voice heard, and they also had the right to vote on matters of importance to their local community. So New England really becomes the heart of what will become American democracy. The idea that the voice of the people has value really comes from colonies like Massachusetts, Connecticut, especially from Rhode Island. Focus question number 1. How were colonial governments influenced by political changes in England? Main idea 2. English trade laws limited free trade in the colonies. Earning money from trade was one of England's reasons for founding and controlling the colonies. England practiced what was called mercantilism. This was a system of creating and maintaining wealth through controlled trade. Parliament passed a series of laws known as the Navigation Acts to limit colonial trade. The Navigation Acts were meant to place a limit on what the colonies themselves were allowed to do. The colonies complained about trade restrictions, which were actually kind of severe, but for the most part, they weren't really listened to. The Navigation Acts were a disadvantage to the colonists. The colonies were prevented from selling their goods to the highest bidder. They were prevented from buying anything at a lower price, and they were restricted in the growth of manufacturing. Manufacturing actually was forbidden for the most part in the colonies. Colonists were expected to purchase manufactured goods that were made in England that would benefit English manufacturers. They could not seek their own markets where they could buy or sell anything. They had to buy or sell what they were told, where they were told. And on top of that, they were not allowed to trade freely with other nations. All goods that came out of the colonies had to be shipped to an English port first, and their taxes would be assessed on it, and English merchants would then take these goods and sell them to any foreign country. So colonial merchants were severely restricted in what they could do, and it limited their ability to grow their own economies. Trade between the American colonies and Great Britain was not direct. The triangular trade was a system in which goods and slaves were traded among the Americas, Great Britain, and Africa. The slave trade brought millions of Africans to the Americas on a voyage called the Middle Passage. And terrible conditions on the Middle Passage caused thousands of captives to die on slave ships. Here we have a diagram of the way that this triangular trade worked. From Great Britain, manufactured goods would be shipped to the English colonies in North America and to the West African coast. On the West African coast, these manufactured goods would be traded for slaves. Slaves would then be shipped to the Americas. They didn't all go to one place. The slave trade from Western Africa went to the Portuguese-controlled Brazil. Slaves were shipped to Central America, to the Caribbean, and to English North America as well. Of the 15 million or so people who were kidnapped in Western Africa to be sent to the Americas, about 400,000 of them would end up here in English North America, and after 1783, the United States, where the slave trade would continue until 1809, when the international slave trade was outlawed. Focus question number 2. How did English trade laws limit free trade in the colonies and influence the development of the triangular trade? Main idea 3. The Great Awakening and the Enlightenment led to ideas of political equality amongst many colonists. In the Great Awakening, religious leaders wanted to spread religious feeling. This was especially important after the calamity that came with events like the Salem witch trials in the early 1690s. A lot of people turned away from the church, and in the 1730s and 1740s, religious leaders wanted to bring people back to the church. The Great Awakening is a religious movement that swept the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s and fundamentally changed American religion. Revivals became popular places to talk about political and social issues. People would gather together in what were called revival meetings, often held outdoors, And anybody who showed up to the revival, regardless of what their standing in society was, whether they were rich or poor, whatever they were seen as being children of God, and so in the revival meeting they were perfect equals, and there they could discuss things openly, and new ideas were exchanged as a result of being at these revival meetings. And one of the things that became very, very clear in these revivals is people's willingness and desire to resist the authority of the British government itself. There was a lot of things that the British government was enforcing upon the colonies that colonists themselves resented. And at these revival meetings, they talked about these things freely and openly. And so ideas that would eventually sprout into the idea of real resistance to British authority, they take root here in the revival meetings in the 1730s and 1740s. In the Enlightenment, this was a secular movement of the 1700s that spread the idea that reason could improve society, that through thinking, the use of logic, you could improve the condition of human beings. Much like the revival meetings, in the Enlightenment, they also formed ideas about how government should work, and said that people had natural rights such as equality and liberty, something that was also being talked about in revival meetings. So even though the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment began very differently, in a lot of ways people seemed to arrive at the same kinds of conclusions, whether it be because of religion or because of using reason and logic. The movement of the Enlightenment, much like the Great Awakening, had a great influence on colonial leaders. Focus question number 3. How did the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment lead to ideas of political equality among many colonists? Main idea 4. The French and Indian War gave England control of more land in North America. Native American allies. Some Native Americans allied with colonists in the late 1600s in what was called King Philip's War. King Philip was a chief of the Wampanoag, and his actual name was Metacom or Metacomet. And the war between the Wampanoags and the English settlers in Massachusetts it was a war of extermination, truthfully. Some Native Americans sided with the English, some with the Wampanoag. In the end, the Wampanoag were defeated. Many of them were kidnapped and sold into slavery in the sugar plantations of the West Indies. But in the end, the English colonists secured all of Massachusetts for themselves. Further to the north, the French traded and allied themselves with the Algonquian peoples and the Huron. As mentioned in a previous lesson, the French attitude toward Native Americans was very different from the English. The English attitude about Native Americans basically was that this land is ours now and you're going to get out, or we will destroy you. The French attitude about Native Americans was more along the lines of being cooperative with them, not the least because in the French colonies, at least in the very beginning, the French families didn't come. It was mostly young men, and these men who had intended to come to America and earn their fortune and go back to France and marry the girl of their dreams, oftentimes they ended up marrying into Indian tribes and becoming part of the family. And because of this, the relationship between the French and Native Americans was very different from that between the English and Native Americans. The English, for their part, allied with the 5 tribes of the Iroquois League, also known as the Iroquois Confederation. Now, with Native American tribes, trade or friendship meant that basically it was like a family relationship. If I trade with you, you're part of my family. If I form an alliance with you, you are part of my family. And whoever it is that is your enemy, then their friends are my enemy as well. The Iroquois were deadly enemies of the Huron and Algonquians in Canada. The English were enemies of the French, and so these alliances between these European powers and Native Americans in the New World, they had a benefit for each other. Now the English, who are allied with the Iroquois, will fight against the Iroquois' enemies, and the Iroquois will fight against the enemies of the English. Similarly, the French allied with the Huron means that the Huron will fight the enemies of the French, which are the English, and the French will fight the enemies of the Huron, who are the Iroquois. War erupts between France and Great Britain, and this happens repeatedly throughout the late 1600s and through the early to middle 1700s. France and Britain continually struggled for control of North America. The French and Indian War started in 1754 by accident. Truthfully, it was an accident of mistake, a mistake that was made by a young colonel of the Virginia Colonial Militia, a young man who was desperate to make a name for himself, a young man who wanted more than anything in the world to be a officer in the Royal Army, serving under the British King. And this colonial militia colonel's name was George Washington. Washington led an expedition across the Appalachian Mountains into the area where the Ohio and Monongahela rivers meet. And there at the confluence of these rivers, Washington led a group of colonial militia, a small group of British regular army soldiers, and some Native American allies that were led by a war chief that was known as the Half King. And in 1754, Washington came upon a group of French soldiers who were traveling actually under a flag of truce. And amongst the number of men with this French party was a French diplomat by the last name of Jumonville. And Washington didn't really have very good control of the men under his command, particularly not the Native Americans. The Half King and his warriors had come to fight. Washington was on a mission of observation. He was there to find out what the French were doing in the Ohio River Valley. And the Half King, without orders from Washington, launched an attack on this French party. And in the fighting that broke out, the French diplomat Jumonville was killed. Washington ill-advisedly retreated to an open meadow where he and his men hastily constructed a defensive fort. There were large numbers of French troops, their Native American allies, French fur trappers known as the Coureurs de Bois, who were in the area, and they very quickly surrounded Washington and his small band of about 400 or so men, and laid siege to them. The Half King and his warriors left because they had accomplished their task. They attacked and killed their own enemies, and so they left Washington and the militia and the British regular army troops there to fend for themselves. And Washington handled the whole thing very badly. It was a bad first command. He was only 23 years old. He had no idea what he was doing. At any rate, what ended up happening was that Washington was forced to surrender after a long siege, and he had to sign a treaty in which he accepted full responsibility for what happened to Jumonville. And the treaty was written in French, and Washington couldn't speak, read, or write French. He had no idea what he was signing. The French used this as an excuse to declare war on Great Britain, and this war that breaks out in 1754, caused by accident because of the inept actions of George Washington, will last for nearly another decade, nearly another 10 years. It will grow truthfully into what some historians refer to as the first real World War. It starts out as a small skirmish in North America and erupts into a war that envelops Europe Fighting takes place in Africa, in the Indian Ocean, and fighting's all over the place. It is a global conflict. Fighting in North America will end in 1759, 4 years before the whole war is completely over. The British, from the first part of the war, were losing, but by 1759, the British captured Quebec and got control of the St. Lawrence River. And with control of the St. Lawrence River, the French had no ability to control anything in the interior of North America. And so the French lost New France. They lost all of their possessions in America. In 1763, the warring parties signed the Treaty of Paris. This treaty gave Canada to Britain. France received some lands east of the Mississippi River, but for the time being, at least, France's role in North America was over. It was done. Everything now, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to the Arctic Circle, all of it became British. And this leads to another issue, because many of the Native Americans out here past the Appalachian Mountains, many of them were allies of the French, and they were not at all in favor of what happened here. Most colonial settlements prior to the French and Indian War had been made along the Atlantic coast. Colonial settlers, or pioneers, began to move westwards immediately after the war was over, and what these settlers, mainly from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, what they were after was the rich farmland here along the Ohio River. This valley right here, the Ohio River Valley, is some of the finest farmland anywhere in the world, and these people were farmers by trade. And there is nothing that a farmer wants more than more and better land. And so these people begin moving westward to farm new land that they now consider to be theirs. Native Americans, led by a chief named Pontiac, rebelled against new British settlements in 1763. And Native American tribes began attacking British settlers who were moving across the Appalachian Mountains. And what that meant was now the British Army has to cross the Appalachian Mountains to try to defend British citizens from being slaughtered. And a war breaks out between the British and Native Americans who had formerly been allies of the French. The conflict ended partly because of an outbreak of smallpox, which some people believe was actually intentionally caused by a British Army officer who spread the disease by distributing smallpox-infected blankets to Native Americans. He supposedly posed as a merchant and gave these smallpox-infected blankets to the mostly members of the Miami Nation. Now, whether this is true or not, I don't know. A lot of people believe it, but I think the jury is really out on that. In any case, there was an outbreak of smallpox, and it did severely affect the ability of Native Americans to continue fighting. A treaty was signed ending the fighting, and the King of England, George III, issued a proclamation in 1763 which banned further settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. And that line is on the map here, where my little red cursor is going. This is the proclamation line of 1763. After the French and Indian War, westward settlement was banned. And the reason why it was banned mostly is because the French and Indian War and the war that grew out of it, a conflict called the 7 Years' War, bankrupted Great Britain. The British had basically spent everything that they had on fighting the war. And the king knew that another war being fought in the Americas would only make economic matters worse. And so he banned further settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, instead opened much of what had been French Canada up to settlement. But the colonists in this part of North America, they didn't want to move to Canada. They wanted to move west, and so this causes a lot of heartburn, so to speak, a lot of anger directed at the king. Heavily in debt from the 7 Years' War, George III of Great Britain wished to avoid further fighting with Native Americans, therefore issued a proclamation declaring that the Appalachian Mountains be the temporary western boundary for all colonies. Colonial governors were forbidden to grant land to settlers west of this boundary without the king's permission. This proclamation angered colonists, especially those who owned shares in land companies that were basically selling real estate to the West. They wanted to be able to sell land to make money. Other people saw it as an infringement on their basic rights, especially men who had served in either in the colonial militia or in the regular army during the fighting of the war. They saw it as their right to move west to take advantage of the territory that they felt that they had won and that was owed to them. And this proclamation of 1763 actually ends up being one of the major long-term causes of the American Revolutionary War. Focus question number 4. How did the French and Indian War give England control of more land in North America, and what were the immediate effects? The essential question for life in the English colonies. Explain how the English colonies continued to grow despite many challenges.